top story tonight. The Fed's preferred inflation index rose, the PCE, 2.6%, as tariffs drive up the price of goods. It's the highest level since February. Economic observers suggesting the Fed's 2% target may not be appropriate. Mohammed El-Arian's written that inflation remains above 2% 4 years after its initial surge, and that it should prompt the Fed to review its goals. Bill Dudley is the former president of the New York Fed. Joins me now. You know Mohammed well. Is he right? Do you think that a revision, I mean, if you can't hit the target after long enough, you change the target. Should it be raised to 3%?
I don't think so, because if you move the goalpost once, the risk is, from market's perspective, that you might do it again. So if you want to keep inflation expectations well anchored, you need to keep the inflation target the same. You can't just say, oh, we're not making it that target, so let's raise the target. It'll be easier to hit. Also, I think there's plenty of room to cut rates to stimulate the economy. So, I mean, one of the reasons why people were talking about having a higher inflation rate target was, getting stuck at the zero lower bound for interest rates. But with interest rates above 4%, there's plenty of room for the Fed to cut to stimulate the economy. So I think the Fed needs to just stick to what they're doing, which is be stubborn and get inflation back down to 2%. If we keep staying here, 2.5%, 3%, inflation expectations eventually are going to become unanchored, and that's going to make the Fed's job a lot harder to do.
So how would you have voted at the meeting this week?
I would have voted right along with Powell. The reality is the labor market's in balance. We're at a 4.1% unemployment rate. Yes, job hiring has slowed down, but as Powell pointed out in his remarks, the growth of the labor force has also slowed down dramatically because of deportations and the crackdown on immigration. So the labor market's in balance, and as you just noted, inflation is above the Fed's 2% objective. So there's no real compelling reason to cut rates at the current time. Also, as we know, there's tremendous uncertainty about tariffs. I mean, even as we approach the August 1st deadline, it's still not clear what's actually going to happen. I just saw today that Mexico is going to get a 90-day extension. So the tariff uncertainty is going to persist. And unless you know exactly what tariffs are going to be and how that pass-through of tariffs occurs into prices, you're conducting monetary policy with a lot of uncertainty.
What do you believe in terms of the tariff inflation? Is it a one-shot? Listening to Chair Powell, he seems to suggest it's a one-shot and doesn't become sticky, but it's very difficult to know.
It's one shot and not sticky if the Fed convinces people that they're going to get inflation back down to 2%. If the Fed, just is very relaxed that, we don't have to worry about this uptick in inflation because it's just temporary, and that causes inflation expectations to be unanchored because we've been above inflation of 2% for several years now, then the Fed has a problem. So the Fed has to behave in a way consistent with the risk that inflation expectations become unanchored to keep them anchored.
The two who dissented, dissension, the chair put a best face on it. He explaining that he thought they gave their reasons and so be it. But it's uncomfortable when there are two.
Yeah, but look at who dissented. The two governors that were appointed by Donald Trump in their first term were the ones that dissented, no one else. So there seems to be a political aspect of this. I think most people think that Governor Waller is essentially auditioning for the Fed job. And Michelle Bowman just got appointed vice chair of supervision by the Trump administration. So you could take this as a bit of a thank you. So I think that, there's not really that much division within the Fed.
Okay.
If you look at the summary of economic projections, everyone has rates going down over the next year or two.
Right. But it does also mean that when the chair leaves or changes next year, there will be a more favourable chair to the president. Now, I've read your views, but the rest of the committee aren't, they're not sitting there as potted palms. They will obviously have a view. But he gets several chances to influence the makeup of the committee, including the chair. So the perspective of the doves will be greater than the hawks.
Well, that remains to be seen. Remember, there's 7 governors. Only 2 have been appointed by Trump up to date, and then there's 5 voting Reserve Bank presidents. Look, I think at the end of the day, once you actually have the job, You want to achieve the mission of keeping inflation under control and the economy at full employment. So just like when people are appointed to the Supreme Court justices don't always behave in the way that the president who appointed them hoped.
Seeing a bit of chatter in the markets about the way in which the government, the administration, the Treasury, and the debt agency is selling at the short end, and thereby artificially ensuring long end stays lower. Do you buy that?
Well, I think they are shortening the average maturity of the debt, but they're doing it in a very, mild way. We got the quarterly Treasury refunding announcement yesterday, and what it showed is they're keeping the auction sizes in the long end fixed in size, and they're issuing most of the borrowing needs incrementally in the short end. This did not surprise people, and this is typically what happens when you have a big borrowing need. The borrowing needs right now are enormous because we have a big budget deficit, and the Treasury needs to rebuild its cash balance at the Fed. So typically when there's a big surge in borrowing, most of it occurs in the short end.
Let's just talk about this. Go helicopter yourself up, if you will, Bill, from away from sort of the minutiae of this meeting or last meeting. Is the US inexorably marching towards a thumping big debt crisis in the future if they don't, if the deficit is not addressed? Is Armageddon inevitable?
Well, I think we're on an unsustainable path, that's for sure. That's why the Trump administration is so focused on getting interest rates down, because the debt service costs are a big part of the story. The Congressional Budget Office estimated that if you had interest rates 1% lower, you'd save $3.5 trillion on debt service costs over the next 10 years. But you can't set interest rates where you want just because you want to save on debt service costs. The interest rates have to be set in a way consistent with your employment and inflation goals. Paul was asked about that yesterday, and he made it very clear. We don't set interest rates with the idea of affecting the financing costs of the federal government. He was very explicit about that point.
Right, but do you think that the US is heading for whether it's in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years?
Oh yeah, I mean, right now
we're on
that track. We're on the wrong track, and then the question is something going to happen to pull us off that track over the next 4 or 5 years? A lot of people are pointing to, well, maybe we could have a productivity growth miracle because of artificial intelligence, and if the economy could grow faster, then we'd have more revenue, or maybe interest rates could come down significantly. But that's sort of mostly in the wishful thinking department. Based on the current Congressional Budget Office projections, the budget deficits are going to average about 6% of GDP every year over the next decade, and the debt burden is going to continue to increase. We're already at 100% debt to GDP ratio. It's going to continue to go up. And we have some real structural issues. Spending on Social Security, Medicare, and debt service all are going to go up pretty dramatically over the next 10 years.
Well, I need to time these interviews so we end on a cheerful note in future. But it's good to see you, sir. Thank you for joining us.
Good to see you. Yeah.
Hope you have
Bye-bye.
a good. Bye bye.